Thank you very much, Professor Chen, for the warm words and for the introduction. Thank you very much to the organizers, Séverine Arsène, for making this possible. We're really delighted to be able to present the World Inequality Report at the Asia Global Institute, and very happy also to partner with the launch of this new journal. So I will present this report that was released in Paris just a few weeks ago, and it's the first time we present it in Hong Kong and in China. This is the fruit of a collective work which regrouped dozens of researchers, and this is the first report of this kind. So there will be others, but this is the first time that we put together this work done in the context of the World Wealth and Income Database, which I will also present. So basically, I will talk first about the global income and wealth inequality dynamics, and then Yang Li will provide more insights, more in-depth discussion of the Chinese inequality dynamics. So I'm here as the co-director of the World Inequality Lab and as the lead coordinator of this report. So basically, WIDWorld, the World Wealth and Income Database, is the most extensive database on the historical evolution of income and wealth. It regroups more than 100 researchers located over all continents. And the novelty of this database is that we produced 100% transparent, open source, and reproducible data for researchers, but also for the general public, for journalists, and for policymakers. And we see this as a very important dimension to our work to really make this data available to everybody in a fully transparent way so that everybody can reproduce our results. So this is a way to make sure that the results are robust, are scientifically valid. So what we find in this report? Well, we find that despite the high growth in emerging countries, including China, and we'll talk more about this, we document a sharp rise in global inequality among world individuals, despite high growth in the emerging world. And we show that the top 1% global earners, the richest 1% individuals at the level of the world, actually captured twice as much global income growth as the bottom 50% since 1980. So a very sharp rise in inequality at the global level, despite strong growth in emerging countries. Now, that being said, we will also discuss in the coming slides and in the coming minutes the fact that there's a vast variety of inequality trajectories followed by countries over the past 40 years. And this is the more optimistic note in this report and in this talk. There's a general rise in inequality since 1980, but the fact that countries followed so different strategies shows that there is room for maneuver, that policies and institutions indeed matter a lot to explain the rise or the moderation of inequality in terms of income or in terms of wealth in different countries. And I will also discuss this point. So I will follow the general structure of the report in 5 parts. I will indeed skip many bits, many country focus. Yang Li will focus on China. We have 12 countries on which we do in-depth analysis, 12 very large countries in the report. So I also invite you, if you're interested to know more about the different topics that I will address here, to go online. The report is translated so far in 8 different languages, the executive summary. Very soon, the full report will be translated also in 8 languages, and everything will be online by the end of the year. At the moment, the full report is only available in English. And the address will be presented at the end of this PowerPoint. So basically, just a few words on the methodology, because this is also truly a methodological work. We feel that there are lots of statistics on global inequality that are presented out there. Very recently, we heard about the Oxfam report. Every year, there's the Credit Suisse report. And we feel that, in fact, we need to bring more transparency, more systematicity in these reports, because many of them are actually based on official inequality statistics, which are based on survey data. And survey data have a main limitation when it comes to understanding the dynamics of inequality, which is precisely that they do not capture properly what happens at the top of income or wealth distributions. And this is problematic because a lot of action took place over the past decades precisely at the top of the distribution. So when the Googles that you put in to study a phenomena do not allow you to properly witness what is happening where the action takes place, this is problematic. So basically what we do in the context of this international research project, is that we combine survey data with fiscal data. Tax data has a very good property, which is that it covers very well the top of the distribution. So we're much better able to track, to witness explosion of top incomes or of top wealth individuals. Okay, so basically this slide just says what I've just been mentioning here, and one addition that I would like to mention is that this work that we're doing at the World Inequality Lab is in fact the continuation of a much longer body of work initiated by Simon Kuznets in the 1950s. So Simon Kuznets, the inventor of GDP, is also the inventor of this methodology, which consists in using tax data in order to track economic inequality across individuals in the population. And indeed, this work was continued by Tony Atkinson, unfortunately, who passed away 1st January 2017. And he was one of the co-directors of the World Inequality Lab. And this report is actually dedicated to Sir Tony Atkinson. And then this work was prolonged by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez. And so one of the criticisms that was actually discussed after the publication of Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty was that it was only focused on developed countries and that it only focused on the top 1%. And the reason for that is that at the moment we did not have the data to focus on a systematic assessment of inequality among the bottom 99% of the population and in emerging countries. And in the past 4 years, this is what we've been doing. We've been adding emerging countries in the list of countries for which we have data, and we have now precise numbers for income levels, wealth levels among the bottom 99% of the population. As soon as we have this, we're now able to have a global distribution of income. Basically, when you have the emerging world, when you have the rich countries, when you don't have only the top 1% of the population, but also the bottom 99%, you can provide a picture on global income inequality. And we feel that this is the first time that this is being done in a systematic way. This is just a snapshot of our website, wid.world, on which you can access all this data. So now what are our results? As I said, we show that the top 1% captured twice as much global growth as the bottom 50% since 1980. We observe a strong rise in income inequality among world individuals despite high growth in China. Why? Because in each country, inequality rose. In most countries, as I will show, there are some exceptions that I will also discuss. And again, it is important here to focus on differences in national trajectories. So this is what I will do in the next 5 minutes. So this is a snapshot of income inequality levels in large countries or regions in 2016. We see on the left the top 10% income share, so the share of national income captured by the richest 10% in Europe, 37%. So in a perfectly equal world, the top 10% would earn 10% of total income. In a perfectly unequal world, they would earn 100%. And we see on the right-hand side, the most unequal region here, which is the Middle East, where the top 10% captures 61% of national income. And we see a variety of situations with China 41% or US, Canada 47%. So this is 2016. Now, where do we come from? On this graph, I show a subset of the countries which we just saw on the previous slides from 1980 to 2016. So it's the same indicator, the share of income detained by the top 10%. And we see a general tendency of increasing inequality. We see that countries that had similar levels of inequality at the beginning of the period, if we look, for instance, at Europe, China, or USA, Canada, we see that at the end of the period, the situation vary very much. Look, for instance, Europe, a relatively moderate rise in inequality as compared to US, Canada, where the rise was more important. Or look at India, for instance, where the rise was extreme. China, from the mid-2000 onwards, was able to stabilize this rise of inequality, and we will discuss this in more details with Yang Li's presentation. So now let me add 3 regions to this graph, namely the Middle East, Brazil, and Sub-Saharan Africa. They appear here at the top of the graph. And we see that in these 3 regions, there is a relative stabilization of inequality levels. If we look at these countries from a broader historical perspective, we see that USA, Canada, Russia, China, Europe in 1980 are actually at a low level of inequality historically. So this is the end of a reduction of income inequality, which indeed took different forms. Communism, China in Russia, mixed economy period in Europe or in the USA. But all these regions actually had a phase of compression of their income inequality from the 50s broadly to the 80s. And then there's a gradual rise afterwards. But it seems that all these regions at the bottom of the graph are actually going towards an inequality frontier set by the Middle East, Brazil, or Sub-Saharan Africa, which actually arguably never went through this period of compression of inequality which we observe in other regions of the world. So the question for Europe, for US, Canada, for China, for India, for Russia is, where are they going to? Are they going back to the world inequality frontier? So that is to the highest level of inequality we observe today and that we've observed over the past 150 years. Before answering this question, let's look at the evolution of inequality from a global perspective. That is, we break down the boundaries, the national boundaries, and we just look at the evolution of inequality among world individuals. And this is what we find. So what do we do on this graph? Basically, we sort the entire world population from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right. We have 100 groups, and we plot on the vertical axis their total real income, so that is net of inflation, growth rate per adult, and for each of these groups of individuals, so from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right. And we show that indeed at the bottom of the distribution, there were high income growth rates, over 100% from 1980 to 2016. So this is indeed the rise of emerging countries. Then if we move forward to the right-hand side of the graph, we see the compression of incomes of the middle class and of the lower classes in the rich world, with income growth rates that were lower than 50%. And in fact, in some countries, they were even close to 0%. So the bottom 50% in the USA actually didn't see any percentage of growth, 0% growth between 1979 and 2014 in the USA. It was a bit better in Europe. But then if you go towards the very right-hand side of the graph, so the very top, the very richest individuals of the world, growth rates are extremely high, above 200%. So this doesn't necessarily answer one key question, which is, do these very high growth rates at the very top of the distribution matter from a macroeconomic point of view? So perhaps these very rich individuals enjoyed very high growth rates, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they captured a very high share of global growth, because by definition, it's just a small fraction of the population. It's just 1% of the population. So how much global growth did they capture? Does it really matter from a macroeconomic perspective? So we answer this question in this graph. Basically, it's the same data, except we present it in a slightly different way. On the horizontal axis, instead of placing our different groups on a population scale, so that is, we give each group a space, a length that is proportional to its population size, we now give to each group a length that is proportional to the share of total growth that it captured from 1980 to today. So basically, in the previous graph, the richest 1% only occupied 1 point. Now the richest 1% occupy 27% of the axis because they captured 27% of total growth. And you see on the left-hand side of the graph, the bottom 50% of the population, which occupied 50% of the scale in the previous graph, now occupy only 12% of the length of the axis because they captured 12% of total growth. So to answer my previous question, yes, the amount of total growth captured by the top 1% at the global level was important. It was twice as much as the bottom 50%. So this was indeed extremely important. So how do we construct such a curve that we have called the global elephant curve of inequality and growth? It is the combination of two curves that we can actually call two cobra curve. So this is the same kind of graph, but just for the Western world, USA, Canada, and Europe. And we see very low growth rates for the bottom 80% of the population, very high growth rates at the top. Okay? Now I will show the same graph for China and India together. Very similar graph, except if you look at the y-axis, you see that growth rates climb up much higher. So 4,000% in this case versus 400% in the previous case, but similar shape. Now it's when you combine these two graphs for two regions which have very different average income level that you come up to an elephant like this. And if instead of only having China, India, USA, Canada, and Europe, you had also all other world regions together, as we do in the World Inequality Report, this is when you come up to this kind of representation, where we in fact adopt a mixed scale at the bottom. As you see, we give ample space to represent what is happening among the top 1%, but we also decide to give the bottom 50% also enough space to represent the fact that it matters because it counts for 50% of the global population. So this is why we stretch the axis on the right-hand side, but also we do not squeeze the bottom 50% on the left-hand side, as they should be if we were adopting a scale by share of growth, as I presented in one of the graphs that I've just shown you. Okay, so another question comes in. Does this extremely important share of growth or captured by the top 1%, or does this extremely important rise in inequality was necessary to have some growth at the bottom 50% of the distribution? According to some thinking, that can be called the trickle-down thinking. You need some level of inequality in order to have growth at the bottom. Our answer to this question is no. You do not need an extremely important rise in inequality in order to generate a rise of incomes at the bottom of the distribution. How can we make this claim? We just look at different country trajectories. And I will just compare two groups of countries, USA, Canada on the one side, and Europe, which are broadly comparable in terms of size, in terms of average income level, in terms of inequality level in 1980. And then I will compare India and China, which are also broadly comparable in 1980. So this is the comparison of USA on the left and Western Europe on the right, where we show in red the top 1% income share, and in blue the bottom 50% income share from 1980 to 2016. Left-hand side USA, right-hand side Europe. What we see, what we document in the USA is a complete inversion of the relative positions of the top 1% and of the bottom 50%. Namely, the top 1% in the USA captured 10% of total income in 1980, and the bottom 50% captured 20%. In 2016, it's the opposite, basically. Whereas in Europe, we see a rise in the top 1% income share from about 10% to 12%, but which is indeed much smaller than in the USA. These two regions actually face the same globalization. These two regions also face the same introduction of new technologies in their economy. So we can rule out new technologies or globalization as a general phenomena as explanatory factors for the rise in inequality in these countries. In fact, the rise in inequality has much more to do with institutional and policy choices made in different sides of the Atlantic. We also see similar diverging trajectories in China and India. China on the left-hand side, India on the right-hand side. Again, the same groups, top 1% in red versus bottom 50% in blue. And we see a strong rise in inequality in China at the beginning of the period and then a stabilization, whereas India was not able to engage into this stabilization, and we see a continued evolution and explosion of inequality in India. Why is that? Much more investment for the bottom 50% in terms of health, education, infrastructure in China, which the Indians were not yet able to implement. And in the US versus the EU case, we see a much higher reduction of progressive taxation in the US, contrary to the EU, a much more unequal access to education and to health in the US rather than in the EU, a falling minimum wage in the US, which had the highest minimum wage level in the world in the 1960s and 70s. And this minimum wage level actually decreased by 30% in the US over the course of time, whereas it increased by factor 3 in a country like France. And this indeed contributes to explain the falling share of the bottom 50% in the USA that we do not witness in Europe. So this was a discussion of global income inequality. Now there are also indeed other dimensions of economic inequality, and another important one, which is sometimes overlooked, even though it's very important, it's the basic distinction between public wealth and private wealth. So national wealth is the sum of public wealth and private wealth, and national wealth is what? So it's the sum of all assets, whether financial or non-financial, net of debts. And we see very strong dynamics in terms of the breakdown between public wealth and private wealth across countries over the past decade. And this is what I will show in the next slides. We see very strong transfers of public wealth to private wealth. This arguably has important consequences on the level of inequality in different countries, because private wealth tends to be more concentrated. A rise in private wealth tends to lead to higher concentration in wealth and in income inequality as a snowballing effect. And also a declining public wealth makes it much harder for governments who want to actually tackle inequality, because governments have less resources to invest in health, to invest in education, to invest in infrastructures that are key to limiting the rise in inequality, as I just said. So this is the evolution of private capital or private wealth and public capital or public wealth in rich countries since 1970. All these are expressed as a percentage of national income. So we see the top series of lines is the evolution of private capital, which basically increases from about 300% of national income in rich countries to about 500% of national income. Now, interestingly, we see that in certain countries like Spain or Japan, we see housing bubbles or financial bubbles in the case of Spain or Japan, and the burst of the bubbles, but these do not affect the general trend that we observe in these countries, nor do the financial crisis that you can witness here in 2007 in many countries. The general trend is a rise in private wealth income ratios. On the other side, there is a decline in public capital. Public capital was about 100%, 70% of national income at the beginning of the period. It is close to 0% for most countries, and in certain countries it's actually below 0%. So what does this mean? Well, this means that if, for instance, the USA wanted to repay their debts, well, they would actually sell all their assets. So all their schools, all public schools, public roads, public hospitals, they wouldn't be even able to repay the totality of their debts. And then the US taxpayers would have to pay a rent to the new owners of schools, of roads, and hospitals, which is not necessarily what US citizens would be happy with. So basically, this is what it means to have a -0 public capital level, and many European countries are actually close to this level. What happened in the emerging world? So here I show the evolution of net private wealth in rich countries, and we add in China and Russia, and we see a sharp rise in private wealth in China and Russia, with levels that catch up with the rich world over the past 40 years. What happened in terms of public wealth? Yongli will discuss this into more details in a few minutes, but basically this is the decline of public capital that I've been discussing before. We see the reduction of public capital. Now, I express this not as a share of national income, but as a share of total wealth. So that is basically, in China, you see 70%, public wealth amounts to 70% of total wealth. So that basically means that the rest 30% is private wealth. So it's a better way to zoom into this issue. We see that China, today, public wealth makes about 40% of total wealth, about 30%. This is more or less the level of public wealth that you observed in rich countries in the 70s, during the mixed economy period. So China today, in terms of public wealth, is at the same level as rich countries in the 1970s. And arguably, as I said before, this means that there's much more room to invest in important sectors for the future, for the reduction of inequality, for investments in environmental protection, and so on and so forth. So the combination of the rise in income inequality and the rise in private wealth and the reduction of public wealth in most countries actually led to a rise in wealth inequality among individuals. So that is not this basic distinction between public wealth and private wealth, but wealth among individuals in a society. And this is what this graph shows, where we see China, France, Russia, UK, US. This is the share of total wealth, captured by the top 1% of the population from the beginning of the 20th century to today. And we see this general tendency to rise. Again, different trajectories, different speeds, very sharp rise in the USA, very sharp rise in Russia, important rise in China, more moderate in the UK and in France. Interestingly, USA, France, UK are not yet back to their early 20th century level. So we're not yet back there, but as you see, the US is pretty close to be back to the wealth inequality levels of the early 20th century. Now, Yongli will discuss more about the different privatization strategies in China and in Russia, which led to the rise of wealth inequality among individuals in these two countries. In the US, it's indeed the combination of privatization, but also of rising inequality that creates the rise in wealth inequality. In France and the UK, the moderation is largely due to the fact that there are rising housing prices and that actually the middle class has a lot of housing as compared to the very top of the distribution that have a lot of financial asset. So rising housing prices actually act as a moderating force to the rise of inequality in these two countries. Okay, so this leads me to the final part of this presentation on global income and wealth inequality, and I will try to be very brief on this one. It's about tackling global inequality. So in the report, we discuss different strategies to tackle inequality, which I will not discuss now. Perhaps we can discuss this during the panel session. I just want to show you one graph. basically, which is projections of future inequality. So this is this graph, where I show at the global level the evolution of the global top 1% income share in red from 1980 to 2050, and the bottom 50% global income share in orange. So the first part of the graph, left-hand side, shows you, what I was saying before. That is, there is a rise in global inequality over the period, despite strong growth in China and in the emerging world. We see that the top 1% income share increases its share. So what will happen in the future? These different scenarios show the evolution of global inequality according to different inequality trajectories. Whether all countries follow the US inequality trajectory, whether all countries follow their own inequality trajectory, the trajectory that they've followed since 1980, or whether all countries actually follow the Europe inequality trajectory. Now, the growth rates are those that are projected by the OECD. So basically, we know that China will have, at least we can hope that China will continue on a growth path, slightly lower than over the past 10 years, but still higher than in Europe. Africa will also grow. Latin America will also grow. So we're relatively optimistic in terms of the total growth rate for each country. And this actually would tend to decrease the level of global inequality in the future. But what we show is that even with optimistic growth rates in all these countries, in the business as usual case, there's still a rise in inequality. And it's only in the European scenario that there's a reduction in global inequality, even though we're still pretty much from a fair situation, because the top 1% still capture a much larger share of growth than the bottom 50% in the European scenario. So I will actually conclude here saying that so again, this is a work that is based on actually the systematic assessment of inequality in all these countries, made by more than 100 researchers in the context of the WIDWorld project. We find a rise in global inequality despite strong growth in the emerging world. But one of the key points that we want to put forward here is more optimism rather than pessimism. These different country trajectories show that there is room for policy, that there is room for institutional change, and Yang Li will actually detail this in the context of China. Thank you very much for your attention.